Welcome back to the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast here on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, and YouTube. On today's episode, sporting news writer Bill Bender joins me to talk about Week 5 in college football. All right, so I just wanted to start off, what are some of the marquee matchups this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, Penn State's obviously at the top of that list. You got 5 ranked matchups. Stanford-Notre Dame will be huge. I think that's the other top 10 matchup you get in there. And then you get into some of the other matchups, even BYU, Washington, Texas Tech, West Virginia earlier in the day. You'll see a little bit of separation. Very excited about this weekend. It closes September, sets up an interesting October for a lot of teams. And remember, there are still 21 unbeaten teams out there.
Exactly, and I just want to touch on some of these matchups right now. So looking at this Penn State-Ohio State matchup, it's a really big game in the Big Ten. What are you looking at in this one?
Just how Ohio State gets out against the whiteout. I mean, the misconception here is that, they'll be intimidated or, this will blow them away. But truth is, the last 3 times they've done there, they've actually gotten off to a good start. And then Penn State's the one that readjusted. Anytime you're dealing with 2 50-point offenses, which is very rare in the Big Ten, if ever happened, you're dealing with the big plays from both teams. Quarterback play would be huge. But the common thread, as it always is in the Big Ten, a team that runs the ball effectively, sets up third and shorts, that'll probably be the team that wins the game.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be a really tough one there for Ohio State. It's a big white out there for Penn State. Now moving over to the Stanford-Notre Dame games, one of the other games you mentioned, a top 10 matchup. Stanford coming off that crazy win against Oregon in overtime. Notre Dame looking strong this season. What is your outlook for that one?
It should be fun. 2 similar programs and how they operate. Stanford, like you said, a lot of momentum from last week. Big win at Oregon. And part of a brutal schedule for the Cardinal. Notre Dame made the switch to Ian Book last week. This is nothing new for Brian Kelly. He's very good at negotiating these kind of things. I think Winbush to play. I think Ian Book to play, and we'll see. I like the Cardinal to win because of their defense. I think it'll be the difference in the fourth quarter. But this one will be every bit as entertaining. Maybe a little bit more low scoring than Ohio State, Penn State. But I think that they're really going to go at it and have fun.
Among these 2 teams, I find this very interesting because we're looking at the Pac-12. There's already some teams like Washington that we thought would win that conference that already has a loss. Notre Dame playing this independent schedule. Between Stanford and Notre Dame, which team do you think needs a win in this game more?
That's tough. Probably Stanford, just because the Pac-12 perception is what it is, but on the other hand, Notre Dame's schedule leaves a lot to be desired on the back half. Doesn't have the advantage of a conference championship game, though I don't know how much bump a Pac-12 North team's going to get from the Pac-12 championship game. I mean, they might be playing a 3-loss Colorado team in the championship. So I think it's about equal. But to your point, the loser is in trouble because, you're already fighting the perception, whether it's not having a conference championship game or playing in the Pac-12. And that top right now is basically a game of who blinks between Penn State or Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and Georgia. And we're kind of all waiting to see which one of those 4 teams will blink. And could be that none of them do until Georgia and Alabama play in the SEC championship game.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm looking at this Notre Dame and Stanford game. They're 2 teams that that want to get to that college football playoff. But like you said, I mean, the top of the SEC there with Georgia and Alabama, and then looking over, having that Ohio State in the Big Ten. Clemson is one of the best teams in the nation. I'm looking at, if you're not among those 4 teams, you might have to be trying to go unbeaten this season if you want a shot to be in the top 4.
Yeah, I mean, we say that every year, and there are losses that pop up. It kind of always depends on when you lose. I think 1 or 2 of them could go unbeaten. But there's opportunities for Alabama to lose. I mean, they still got to go through a tough SEC West schedule. There are opportunities. Georgia and Clemson got the easy paths in a lot of ways. And then, Ohio State's still got to go through Penn State and Michigan State, and there's no guarantees there. I think, especially Michigan, they've gotten their act together a little bit. So Yeah, but I do the same thing. I always think everybody's going to go undefeated this time of year anyway, and I often get criticized for that. But it's hard. It really is hard to see. I'm with you. It's hard to see these teams losing or finding a loss, and that's why if it happens, it'll be very unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, they're just so strong. And now moving over to the Big 12, a conference that hasn't really been talked about. I feel like this that much this season. We're looking at West Virginia and Texas Tech, a top 25 matchup. Now the Red Raiders are in the top 25. What are you looking at in this game?
It might be a little bit of defense, actually. That's what's going to make the difference. Is the team that can get a couple stops. West Virginia is really good with Will Grier on offense, but their defense probably isn't getting as much attention as it deserves. Texas Tech's a really good football team. You know, they've played a lot better since the season opening loss. They get it at home. I think the Big 12 behind Oklahoma, we're kind of waiting to see who's going to challenge the Sooners, and it could very well be the Mountaineers. So, but they might have to do it twice. I mean, they play on Black Friday. That's the crazy thing with Oklahoma and West Virginia. But if you haven't had a chance to watch Will Grier, I'd encourage your listeners to do just that. He's a fantastic ball player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that West Virginia offense with Sills out there as a wide receiver too. It's a really high-powered one. I think one of that people don't really give the credit they deserve sometimes.
Well, I think because there's that general, just because of the scheme, it's seen. The Big 12 has that reputation. I mean, I'm guilty of that too, of seeing it as something, where it's kind of just like 7-on-7 in some ways. But that offense can hit you both ways. I mean, he's got three really good receivers. They run the ball effectively. They have good play calling. It's a good mix of all those things. And, yeah, it works in the Big 12, but I could see that carrying over where West Virginia, with Will Grier at quarterback. Now, if he gets hurt like he did last year, you can see how quickly it falls apart. But when you have the right quarterback at the controls, that's how you win across college football. But in the Big 12 in particular, having that experienced playmaking quarterback makes all the difference when those schools are putting up as many points as they are.
Certainly. And now transitioning, just looking at college football in general, in one of your recent articles, you picked Week 5 against the spread. Among the games, looking at the spread, what do you think are some safe bets this week, and what do you think are some really games you're looking at saying, oh, that's obviously going in one way or the other?
Well, I mean, the way I approach it, none of them are safe. I mean, it's the one I spent a lot of time on was Clemson-Syracuse, because you got to kind of like see it both ways. I could see Clemson coming out and steamrolling them with Lawrence at quarterback because it's at home, but you're giving up 22.5 points, so that's a lot. I don't, that's a tough one. I think if Ohio State wins, they're going to cover. If Stanford wins, that's an obvious upset pick. So, I mean, those are two I'm kind of locked in on, but those are big games too. I do think West Virginia is going to go down to Lubbock and win by a couple touchdowns and make a statement that way. So I guess those are some of the bigger games on there. But, I mean, even Michigan, it looks like a layup, but, Northwestern's coming off a bye week. Maybe they play a little bit inspired. So those are not easy to do. I mean, I'm off to a decent start on those, but that can go away real quickly. That's how they have all those casinos out in Vegas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's against the spread is always something you want to be careful with. And I mean, you mentioned that Syracuse and Clemson game. It looks like you would think a lock for Clemson. Then you look at last year losing against the Orange when no one thought that was possible. College football is just so unpredictable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's predictable, but those upsets, like you said, they come out at the weirdest times. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago when it all happened on one day where Iowa beat Michigan and Pitt beat Clemson and then USC beat Washington, and it ended up blowing up the playoff picture, but it really didn't because Clemson and Washington crawled back in and Michigan just missed their chance against Ohio State. So, again, it's going to be hard to break up that monopoly at the top. Some people might say it's bad for college football. I don't think that's the case, just because if you sit down and watch what Alabama does and watch what Ohio State and Clemson do, I mean, those are the best teams in the country. And, if they end up playing in the playoff, probably lead to some pretty great matchups like it did last year.
Yeah, it certainly will. You got to be excited for that. And so just want to ask one last thing. So now looking at this week, are you looking at any potential upsets? What do you think are some teams, some ranked teams that have the biggest potential to get knocked off this weekend?
Well, Kentucky and Duke are ranked, and they could both lose this week. I think South Carolina matches up pretty well with Kentucky. Although if Benny Snell continues to do what he's doing, it might be a different story there. The other one, Duke, plays Virginia Tech, who's coming off a lost their quarterback. Might seem like a layup, but Virginia Tech still has a lot of young talent, especially on the offensive side of the ball, that matches up well with Duke. So just keep an eye on those two games. I think those are two in particular that could be interesting.
Well, that'll do it. Thank you so much, Bill, for doing this interview. Where can people check your stuff at?
Yeah, I'm at Bill Bender 92 on Twitter. You can check us out at Sporting News and Facebook at Sporting News. And yeah, almost halfway through already, or a third of the way through at least. So I appreciate you having me on, and we'll definitely have to do this again soon.
A big thanks to Bill for coming onto the podcast. Remember, check down in the description for links to all of his social medias, as well as the articles he is writing for Sporting News. That'll wrap it up for this edition of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, and YouTube for my other podcasts, Anything Goes, and the music podcast as well. Also in the description, links to my social medias at JacksonNeill20 on Twitter and Instagram, so go check those out as well. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you all next time.